It's time to join Montana's very own and your voice for agriculture, Talkin' Ag Lane Nordland, for today's Lanecast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Lanecast Ag Podcast in conjunction with the Western Ag Network. Thanks for joining us here today, wherever you listen or watch your podcast. Of course, you can watch these podcast conversations on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. YouTube Music is the new home for Google Podcasts, so make sure and subscribe to wherever you listen or watch these podcast, videocast conversations. And for today's show, we're going to grab some sound bites and video clips from the forecast for the cattle market in 2024. That'll be in the second half of our conversation here today. We'll catch up with our friends at CattleFax that are projecting some pretty good prices for calves here in 2024. And we'll talk about rebuilding of the U.S. cattle herd along with that too. But first, on Tuesday of this week, the 2022 Census of Agriculture was released, and Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack shared some comments with the release of that report, and it's pretty troubling. And it seems every time the Census of Agriculture comes out, it's more troubling, and mainly just we're seeing more farms and ranches, less farms and ranches, each year. And every Census of Agriculture shows that. We're seeing millions of acres of land coming out of agriculture production as well. And obviously the age of farmers and ranchers continues to increase. And we're seeing some young beginning farmers and ranchers coming into the industry, but not at the pace that could keep these farms and ranches out on the landscape, supporting our rural communities and keeping this land that's coming out of agriculture production in food and fiber production. So while the average age of farmers continues to increase, this latest census shows that the average age of a farmer rancher is 58.1 years old. Those are some of the troubling statistics, and I'm not attacking our experienced farmers and ranchers out there. I tip my hat to you. But what I am frustrated with is when folks do get out of the business and they sell that land, or their family sells the farm or ranch, and it's taken out of farming and ranching, and it's developed, or God knows what is done with it. That's concerning. It's concerning for our national security, our food security, but also the viability of our rural communities and the viability of the next generation of farmers and ranchers. Here's some of the comments that Secretary of Agriculture Tom Vilsack shared from the USDA headquarters there in Washington, D.C. this week.
Because I'm concerned about the state of agriculture and food production in this country. In 2017, when we did the survey, there were 2,042,220 farms. Today, the survey reports we have 1,900,487 farms. So doing a little quick math, that's 142,000 fewer farms in 5 years. In 5 years. The survey tells us that in 2017, we had almost, a little over 900 million acres of land and farming. 5 years later, we have 880 million acres. So we've lost 20 million acres. I want to give you a sense of how many acres that is. That's every New England state, with the exception of Connecticut, in 5 years.
Now, obviously, we're seeing less farms and ranches in the countryside. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation here today, from 2017, back in 2017, there was over 900 million acres of farm and ranch ground in production. And 5 years later, that dropped by 20 million acres to 880 million. That $20 million acre reduction, that's troubling. That land, we know that land's never going to go back into farming or ranching. I'm not sure what the majority of that land, what it was used for, but I'm thinking it got developed or, taken out of production, no doubt. But when we look at that too, Secretary Vilsack, which I should point out, Secretary Vilsack was Secretary of Agriculture for 8 years during the Obama administration, and now he is President Biden's Secretary of Agriculture, the longest serving Secretary of Agriculture in the history of the Department of Agriculture. So that's something to think about too, is What are elected and appointed officials doing to help us stay profitable and stay out in the countryside? I'm not going to answer that. That's just a question I'm posing for you to think about, and maybe you can share some of those comments with your elected officials or your agriculture organizations that you belong to. But the secretary, during his comments, actually referenced a report that then Secretary of Agriculture Bob Berglund, expressed back in 1981 about the direction and concerns he saw that U.S. agriculture was taking in the late 70s and into the 80s, which, of course, we know what happened during the 80s with that farm crisis. But here's more with the Secretary of Agriculture.
I've been focusing on this issue for the last 4 or 5 months because I ran across a report done by Secretary of Agriculture Bob Berglund in 1981. And he was expressing concern about the direction of agriculture because we had changed the method of support, a direction of support for American agriculture. It was important for us to continue to increase productivity. And we moved away from a kind of a supply management system where it was established during the New Deal to try to stabilize farm prices and farm income to a more market orientation, more productivity-focused orientation. And American agriculture, as I mentioned, responded beautifully, did an amazing, tremendous job. But Secretary Berglund was concerned in 1981 as he was leaving this job about the impact on the number of farms and the impact on losing farms will have on small communities and rural places. He just issued a warning. Well, if you look at the number of farms that were in existence when he issued that warning and compare it to today, we've lost 535,000 farms. This survey is essentially telling us, asking the critical question of whether as a country, are we okay with losing that many farms? Are we okay with losing that much farmland? Or is there a better way? That's the importance of this survey.
Yeah, so something to think about there. And as we put profitability in mind in these conversations, because there would be more farmers and ranchers in the countryside if profitability was there. And like me, and maybe like you and your spouse, you rely on off-farm income to keep the lights on, to pay your operating note, to stay in livestock production or crop production, whatever that may be. But the Census of Agriculture really did highlight that a majority of farmers rely on off-farm income to keep the lights on, to keep their families fed, and to keep the wolves from the door. And Secretary Vilsack believes that there are better ways to keep farms profitable and a less reliance on that off-farm income. Here's those comments.
Isn't there a better way of taking that farm and asking the question, how can we create the farm, not the farmer, but the farm, capable of creating multiple revenue streams? And that's why it's important for us to invest in climate-smart agriculture, because that creates an opportunity for farms to qualify potentially for ecosystem service market credits, which is cash coming into the farm for environmental results that can occur only on the farm. The farm then creates a second stream of income. That's why it's important for us to continue to promote the notion of bioproduct production, the ability to transition agricultural waste that has little value or no value, or in some cases can be a challenge for some farming operations, and converting it into its own commodity and transitioning it into sustainable aviation fuel or a wide variety of bioproducts that can replace our over-reliance on fossil fuel-based and petroleum-based products. Or the notion that by selling directly to a consumer, instead of through a very extensive and sometimes expensive supply chain, the farmer can actually get a better deal. Every time we go to a grocery store, our statisticians tell us today that about a little bit less than 15 cents of every food dollar that's spent at the grocery store ends up with the farmer. By the time the farmer pays for the production of that product, he or she's got about 7 cents. Can we create a better deal with direct-to-consumer opportunities? This survey talks about farmers beginning to embrace, and we're seeing an increase in the number of farmers understanding that dynamic.
I don't know. I think those comments, especially the talk around climate and whatnot, can be very divisive, I guess, if we want to call it that way, between so many producers in the countryside. But that being said, I do caution a lot of folks that are looking at these new revenue sources for your farms and ranches to do your homework. Don't just jump in because a salesman said, "Hey, this is a good opportunity for you to sell some carbon credits and to pay the ranch off." I've talked with a lot of experts on that. We've had a lot of those conversations on the podcast. Do your homework. Be cautious. Approach anything with caution, because most of the time, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. But to be cautious out there and do your homework. I'm not telling you to do or not to do. Just do your homework and be cautious about any of these ventures that you're going with. But overall, the secretary also did highlight in his talk about the growth that we did see in direct-to-consumer models that farmers and ranchers have been participating in. I tip my hat to anybody that has that opportunity and puts that extra effort into trying to sell direct to consumers and cutting out the middleman. We saw about a 16% increase, in direct consumer sales from 2017 to 2022. 116,617 farms sold directly to consumers. Now, that is a big number, and those are some hardworking individuals. But when you compare that to the 1.8 million, 1.9 million farms and ranches out in the countryside, that's a drop in the bucket, especially when you look at the profitability. The Census of Ag reports $543 billion in ag production from all farmers and ranchers, and that 3.3 billion. While that it's impressive, I tip my hat. I'm not criticizing. There's just so much more opportunity, I think, and it's just something to think about. How do we take our product? How do we make more money off of our land? Do we graze better? Do we work with NRCS or range health experts to try and maximize our pastures, but also put pasture health at the top of the equation too? Just some things to think about here. I'm not trying to get on a pulpit and preach to you all, but again, I just want folks to think a little differently about how they're approaching their operations. I should share a few of the some of the key takeaways from that Census of Agriculture. We are seeing that family-owned operations remain the majority of farms and ranches. 95% of all farms and ranches in the U.S. are family-owned. I think that's a great statistic to share with consumers and people, especially decision makers out in Washington, D.C. I noted at the beginning of our conversation, the average age of farmers and ranchers up a tick in this survey. 58.1 years old is the average age of farmers. But we did see an 11% increase in the number of beginning farmers. But this is the figure that actually made me scratch my head a little bit. Beginning farmers, the average age of a beginning farmer with 10 or fewer years of experience out on a farm or ranch, do you think that age is around 30 to 35? No, it's actually 11 years younger than the average age of a farmer or rancher. It's 47.1 years of age is the average age of a beginning farmer or rancher. But it kind of makes sense. So many of us have to work for a few years, a decade, maybe 20 years before we have the financial stability or the opportunity to move back and maybe help manage and be in the decision-making process there. So I guess I'm not surprised, shocked by it, but I was surprised it wasn't a little younger. But I guess that's more of these conversations that family operations need to have. What can we do to put profitability in mind to bring that next generation back, or sell to a first generation rancher or somebody trying to make a go into the countryside? So I found that pretty interesting. Also, female producers make up 36% of all producers in the countryside, and farms with at least one female decision maker represent 58% of all farms and ranches. So I don't know, just some interesting conversations there, no doubt, about the Census of Agriculture, but we're a small population here in the United States, and we got to work together to have a strong voice and advocate for more opportunities to stay out in the countryside, to be profitable, and to not be dictated to by government mandates. I think that's an agreement across so many farms and ranches out in the countryside. If you recall, we've shared some content here on the podcast about producer profitability, a big initiative that multiple agriculture organizations are pushing, the Montana Stock Growers Association being one of them. And Rusty Ellis with the 21 Mile Cattle Company there in Montana was a panelist. Western Ag Network's Russell Nimitz hosted this panel. And he brought up during this discussion a silent partner, that being the government, and how, passing on that family farm or ranch is truly going to be one of the biggest inhibitors that we have at success and profitability in the future. And I wanted to kind of bring back these comments that he shared. This was in December of 2023, because all this kind of ties together as we're seeing 20 million acres taken out of agriculture in the last 5 years, at least 20 million. It could be more that wasn't reported. We're seeing the average age of farmers and ranchers continue to grow, but then we also have the threat of the death tax, or estate tax is the appropriate term, I guess, to use in the IRS's view. But that tax code changes every few years. Every administration has different initiatives. And I just want to share these comments that Rusty shared during the Stock Growers Convention, which I think are very enlightening.
Another factor that we have to look at is our silent partner in this thing, and that's Uncle Sam. And it doesn't matter whether it's yearly or when we hand this to the next generation. The changes that are coming make those changes incredibly difficult. And if these kids are going to have a shot and be able to move forward with this industry and the security of arguably the nation and its food supply, we have to be able to move the asset from the current generation to the next, and there has to be enough there that they have the ability to carry the flag forward. There's look around this room, there are a tremendous amount of kids that are just begging for a shot, and we've got to figure out how to make that happen. And it's not a local problem, it's not a Montana problem, it's a nation problem. And we have to address, amongst a million other things, the silent partner in the room and how on earth we deal with him.
I think that's a big question that we have to ask. And it's been very interesting reading the comments on the Western Ag Network YouTube channel for that full panel, that producer profitability panel that aired back in December. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you. I'll put the link in the description. Very insightful, very in-depth conversations and kind of awkward, important conversations that we need to have, especially in the livestock industry. There's a lot of tools that are new for producers to use through USDA and whatnot that some are skeptical about and whatnot. So they really dive into depth there. But just the risk of that estate tax or the death tax, and yeah, it's like a $26 or $30 million exemption right now under current tax law, but that's going to sunset in 2025. So that could revert to $1 million or less, depending on whatever lawmakers pass. And Rusty said that we had kind of a unique opportunity as well to work with lawmakers that in the past maybe haven't respected livestock producers, farmers, or ranchers in the past, but those maybe elected officials from the city have a greater maybe appreciation for farmers and ranchers and the food and fiber they produce because of how we kept people fed, not just today, but how we stepped up as essential workers and components during COVID-19. Rusty has a unique perspective on that as well.
There's no question that Congress is really good at doing nothing. And the bottom line is that's all they have to do to revert us back to our previous levels of exemption. Now, there's plenty of force that some would call them our enemies, and I don't know that they're far wrong, that would like to take this back to a 2009 level. If we do that in this country, it not only affects everybody in this room, but I don't care what town you're from in Montana, it affects almost every business on Main Street. This is not just an us problem. It's huge. And government gets, in my humble opinion, a big enough cut as it is. But through our discussions and everybody gathered around a table, and there's been a pile of us in this process, we found out some kind of interesting things, that we have some allies now generated by COVID, believe it or not, that these inner city legislators that were not necessarily agriculture's best friend have got enough noise from home that the food insecurity thing really matters. And this is a chance, I think, probably a once in a generational chance, to push this to the front of the agenda and get some real meaningful tax legislation done, not only on the death tax, but on a lot of it. And frankly, without those steps, the next generation has some real difficulties even starting.
Again, this is kind of a smorgasbord of taking in this latest census of agriculture and that alarming rate that we are seeing as producers continue to get older, more land coming out of agriculture, and producer profitability really being a top concern. And interesting comments after the Secretary of Agriculture made his observations and shared his concerns on that drop that we've seen in the number of farms and ranches out in the countryside, because he was Secretary of Agriculture for 8 years during the Obama administration. Now he's Secretary of Agriculture again, longest serving. I guess, how do we make changes? How do we have our voices heard? How do we put producer profitability in mind? And again, I would encourage you to, I'll share the link to that full conversation on that producer profitability panel, because it is important. They're important conversations to have. We don't need to just have these conversations down at the stockyards, at the cafe, or at the bar, or at the kitchen table at home. We can't just sit back and complain. That's obvious. But I'm kind of rambling at this point, friends, but thanks for joining us here on the Lanecast Ag Podcast. As I mentioned, we're going to share a few of the forecasts on the cattle markets for 2024. We're going to be joined by Randy Blach with CattleFax right after this.
Show your pride in America's beef farmers and ranchers with the all-new Support American Cattle Producers t-shirt from Magnolia Loom. Every shirt we make is 100% grown, sewn, and printed right here in the USA by our family-run small business. We use only the highest quality cotton from Georgia farmers to ensure that our products support American agriculture. Visit magnolialoom.com and click shop to buy your Support American Cattle Producers t-shirt today.
Well, as we come back today at CattleCon in Orlando, I guess just over 2 weeks ago, cattle producers were pretty eager to hear what the CattleFax outlook was going to be for 2024. Western Ag Network, we caught up with Randy Blach, he's CEO of CattleFax, and I tell you what, we're expecting to see nearly $3 calves for 5.5 weight steer calves here in 2024. And I've said on all of our reports on radio and TV that we really wish we had our cattle herds of yesteryear to go along with these prices and inflation, but I guess the prices could be worse, and we'll take them as they come. But here's some of the comments by Randy Blach on what the cattle market's going to shape up to be this year.
Well, I think if we're looking at calf prices across the country, we're looking at a 5.5 weight calf, we're going to average close to $3. You know, for an annual average, you know, you'll see some swinging around these numbers. I think it's important that everybody recognize that plus or minus 10% is the way these markets move. We can see a pretty big move. We just saw it in the last 3 months, didn't we? Mm-hmm. So I would say around $3 on calves, $2.90 to $3 for an annual average. Obviously, they're going to be stout going into spring grazing because there's just not enough of them out there. Feeder cattle prices on an 8.5 weight steer around $2.40 for an annual average. So both those classes of cattle are substantially higher. And for the fed cattle producers out there, I would say we're looking at another $8 to $10 hundred increase in annual average fed cattle prices, getting up here where we average 184, 185, somewhere in that neighborhood for the year. So
now I know what you may be thinking now. You're like me, kind of getting that itch that maybe we need to start rebuilding our cattle herds with that prospect of these $3 calves. But it takes us back to 2014 when prices were pretty good too. And then we got a little greedy in the cattle industry because the weather shaped up pretty good and we rebuilt the cattle herd in a pretty quick fashion. And none of us want that feeling in our guts that when we were watching the livestock videos, sales back there in 2016 in particular, and seeing what those prices did, and we cratered out the market pretty fast. But it's all dependent on weather, of course, and some other factors, including drought and interest rates and prices of these cattle moving forward. Randy shares more on that outlook for herd rebuilding and what's going to cost for replacement females.
You know, if I look through the fourth quarter of the year and into early 2024, I would put a range around where these higher quality bred heifers have traded here through the central northern plains region of the U.S., the West, a full range of about 2,400 to 3,000. And I would say the bulk of them averaged in here 25, 26, 2,700. My guess is that price level is going to continue to move higher as we push forward. I mean, relatively speaking, with calf prices at the levels they are, the value of a bred heifer is historically on the low end of the range of what you would see from a ratio standpoint. So I think they'll move higher.
As for expansion of the cattle herd, drought is obviously a factor, but interest rates are also an inhibitor.
10% interest is holding people back. It's a big deal. If you got a $3,000 bred heifer and you got 10% interest and you're borrowing that money, that's a big coupon that you're behind right out of the box. So that's going to slow the rate of we won't see a herd expansion, in my opinion, of anywhere near the swiftness of what we saw in 2014 and 2015. And quite frankly, I do believe that's one of the big obstacles for many producers. They remember how fast this market came off those highs from 15 and 16. I mean, if you expanded to 15, by the fall of 16, those cattle were worth half as much.
Interest rates, input costs, everything that keeps us up at night and maybe complaining. We won't call it complaint. We'll call it solution finding and conversations down at the stockyards at the cafe. But I appreciate you all joining us here today and for joining us on the video aspect of the podcast or just the audio. I wouldn't want to look at me this whole time either in my unibrow here today. But friends, I hope I was able to provide you with some conversations and some things to think about. Sometimes as a farm broadcaster, we share good news, but a lot of the time we share a lot of the negative and bad news. But I'm just trying to share this information that can hopefully let us think about our futures and that next generation, that generation that hasn't even been born yet, that doesn't even know that they want to come back to the farm or ranch. We have to be profitable. We have to have the information in front of us to help make solutions and decisions to help move us into the future. So hopefully some of these conversations helped here today. And if you haven't done so, click subscribe and join us here on the Lanecast Ag Podcast, or follow along on the Western Ag Network YouTube. That's a great source to keep up to speed on all the ag news and information each and every day. But friends, I appreciate you joining us here today on the Lanecast Ag Podcast. I'm Lane Nordlund. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you for tuning in to the Lanecast with Talkin' Ag, Lane Nordlund. For more on Lane, check out his Facebook page, Lane Nordlund Ag Broadcaster, and NordlundCommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lanecast on your Apple or Android devices. We look forward to joining you next time on the Lanecast.